I attempted to beat Jedi Survivor without any upgrades, which means I had to go through the entire main story without spending any skill points, unlocking any perks, collecting any stim canisters, and even collecting any force essences. Since these are upgrades that can actually be avoidable, allowing for this challenge to work, because unfortunately there are a few upgrades that aren't avoidable, simply because you get them whilst you're advancing the main story. But these upgrades don't actually do much, with the only ones that really matter being the lightsaber stances. So I'm not going to count them, and it is definitely not an excuse so I can actually use the dual wield stance in a run for once. Anyway, for the first time in 9 months, I started a new playthrough that wasn't New Journey Plus. And to be perfectly honest, this challenge was a lot harder than I expected it to be, especially when I got to the first meditation point thinking I could just rest and leave. But oh boy was I wrong, since on a New Journey playthrough, the game gives you a sort of tutorial, and one of these tutorials is how to spend a skill point, and it does not let you leave a meditation point until you spend 1 skill point, which, as you can imagine, for a challenge where one of the rules is to not spend a skill point, this was a huge problem. But luckily the game saves every time you access a meditation point, so basically I figured out that you can force close the game and reopen it, and you'll continue on from the meditation point, allowing you to avoid the game forcing you to spend a skill point. However, you can imagine that became pretty annoying pretty quickly, so I had a choice of 3 options. Number 1, I continued what I was doing and just had to deal with the long delay every time I access the meditation point to save and get back the very little amount of health that you actually have. Or 2, just ignore meditation points and just never be able to save. Or 3, unlock 1 skill point and just avoid using that skill point and carry on with the challenge. And as you can imagine, I picked option 3 and chose the lunging strike skill point on the single blade stance, since it was the only one I could unlock. But I never actually used that ability, and the moment I was able to get the dual wield stance, I swapped out the single bladed for the dual wield, meaning it was impossible for me to actually even use that ability that I unlocked. So yes, technically right off the bat I pretty much failed the challenge, but I'm not going to count it as a fail since I never used the skill I unlocked. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, don't forget to subscribe, as it actually helps out the channel a lot. Thank you. Now, at the start of the game and for most of the beginning of the story, your challenge isn't that hard, as this is mostly due to the fact that this point in the game expects you to barely have any upgrades. As well as the enemies are much easier since it's New Journey and not New Journey Plus, meaning I don't have the warrior perk, which causes the game to spawn harder versions of enemies, which I completely forgot about, and I was hoping to see harder enemies than the ones I got. However, as you progress, you get to areas of the game that all of a sudden just become really hard, and that is all down to the fact that you have barely any health, and you only have 2 stim canisters that only heal roughly half of your health bar, and you have to face off against multiple enemies all at once. And because of that, I died a lot in this challenge, and this was the hardest challenge I've done so far in Jedi Survivor. Luckily, a lot of the areas in this game where you do have to face off against a huge amount of enemies, or really difficult ones, you can actually avoid them and run straight past them, which is what I had to do a few times. Now, although groups of enemies were a pain in the arse, they were nowhere near as hard as the boss fights, because oh my god. In my blaster only video, I mentioned how easy the Ravis boss fight is if you're only using the blaster, and how it only took me 1 attempt. Well, this time it took me many, and I mean many attempts to beat Ravis, and it is all down to the fact that I have no skills or perk points to aid in the fight. I couldn't even use the method in the blaster only video, as I can barely even replenish my ammo or even do a charge shot. And worst of all, I had barely any health. If I made a mistake, it would most likely lead to me dying. And so for a lot of the challenge, it did become very much me just being very aggressive. Plus I also didn't have any extra damage that some skills and perks give you. So I died a lot, and I mean a lot. Mostly because in the first fight being aggressive was the way to go, but in the second fight I continued to be aggressive, which was definitely a mistake, because as soon as I decided to be a little more defensive and stop being so aggressive, I was actually able to beat the boss fight. And then there's Dagon Gera. First fight, I only died once, not that bad. Second fight, I died 6 times, again, not that bad. Third fight, I died 41 times. And you know what? Most of it was because of Bode. Also because in the third part of that boss fight, there are a lot of attacks that are insanely hard to avoid with this little amount of health and pretty much make them insta-kills. The fight itself wasn't actually that hard though, it just took me a while and a lot of deaths simply because I kept messing up. But also because in the first part of the fight you have Bode with you, and sometimes you can actually get to the second part of the fight before Bode actually does anything, but other times he just tries to fight immediately, or when he fights Dagon, he throws him off, and then he throws me off, and he just distracts me every single time. There are so many times where I've looked back at the footage where I have died simply because Bode has decided to attack Dagon together, throwing everything off. God, I really hate Bode. And then there's the Bode boss fight, pretty much the same as the Ravis and Dagon boss fight. Isn't really that hard, it's just very punishing when you have barely any health. So a simple mistake usually leads to you dying, and like Dagon, his third part of the fight is really hard because there are attacks that are hard to avoid and are pretty much just instant failures. But like with every challenge for Jedi Survivor, once you've defeated Bode, that is the end of the game, and I managed to successfully complete the challenge, unless you count that skill point, but whatever. Anyway, I now have a save file that has nothing on it, so I can now use it on New Journey Plus to start with the perks that New Journey Plus gives you without anything else, which I'm going to use for future challenges. So if you want to see that, then please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. See ya!